Which? You shouldn't be here. My daughter-in-law said those words loud enough for half the restaurant to hear before she shoved my dinner plate across the table and sent my salmon sliding onto the white tablecloth. For a moment, nobody moved. The piano player near the bar stopped mid-song. A waitress froze beside our table holding a tray of iced tea glasses. Even the couple sitting behind us lowered their voices and turned to stare. I looked down at the ruined tablecloth first. The lemon butter sauce had dripped onto my folded napkin, soaking the delicate embroidered flowers I'd stitched by hand nearly 20 years ago. Then I looked at my son. Daniel didn't defend me. He didn't even look surprised. He just rubbed his forehead slowly like a man exhausted by an inconvenience he'd been expecting all evening. That hurt more than Vanessa's words ever could. I folded the napkin carefully and placed it beside my untouched water glass. My hands were steady. At 67 years old, I had learned long ago that dignity was often quiet. Maybe we should all calm down, Daniel muttered under his breath, though he still wouldn't meet my eyes. Vanessa laughed sharply. Calm down? She invited herself to our anniversary dinner, Daniel. Her diamond bracelet caught the light as she pointed toward me with one perfectly manicured hand. She always does this. Every special moment somehow becomes about her. A few people nearby exchanged uncomfortable glances. Someone coughed softly. The smell of garlic bread and grilled steak suddenly made my stomach turn. I hadn't invited myself. Daniel had called me 3 nights earlier and asked if I wanted to join them for dinner at Bellamy's, the nicest restaurant in Scottsdale. It'll be good for all of us, he'd said. Things have been tense lately. I should have known better. Families rarely invite you to dinner when they've already decided your place no longer belongs at the table. Still, when your only child asks to see you, hope has a way of making fools of mothers. I had spent over an hour getting ready that evening. I curled my silver hair carefully and wore the navy silk blouse my late husband always loved. Frank used to say navy. Made my eyes look younger. Standing in front of my bathroom mirror earlier that evening, I'd almost smiled remembering the way he used to straighten my necklace before church on Sundays. Frank had been gone for 4 years now, but some habits of love never really leave you. When I arrived at the restaurant, Vanessa kissed the air beside my cheek without touching me. Her perfume smelled expensive and cold. Daniel gave me a brief hug before checking his phone again. Their table was already half finished with appetizers by the time I sat down. No one had waited for me. I noticed little things after that. Vanessa had ordered wine for herself and Daniel, but not for me. She kept steering every conversation toward their upcoming move to Sedona. Daniel talked excitedly about renovations and property taxes, while Vanessa nodded proudly beside him. Nobody asked how I'd been sleeping lately. Nobody mentioned my recent doctor appointment. When I tried to speak about Frank, Vanessa quickly changed the subject to kitchen countertops. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes from realizing people no longer see you as a person, only as an obstacle standing between them and the life they want. I felt that loneliness sitting at the edge of their polished booth while candlelight flickered across crystal glasses. About halfway through dinner, Vanessa finally pulled a thick envelope from her purse and slid it across the table toward me. Since we're all together, she said sweetly, Daniel and I thought this might be a good time to discuss the property situation. I stared at the envelope without touching it. Daniel shifted uncomfortably beside her. Mom, it's just paperwork, he said quickly. Nothing complicated. But I already knew. Weeks earlier, Grace Whitmore had warned me that Vanessa had been asking questions about Frank's vacation property outside Flagstaff. Questions about ownership transfers. Questions about retirement communities. Questions about how quickly elderly residents adjusted to assisted living. You need to pay attention, Grace told me over coffee one morning. Women like Vanessa don't remove people all at once. They erase them slowly. At the time, I thought she was exaggerating. Sitting there in Bellamy's beneath soft amber lighting while my daughter-in-law smiled across the table, I realized Grace had been right about everything. I'm not signing anything tonight, I said calmly. Vanessa's smile disappeared instantly. Excuse me, she asked. I pushed the envelope gently back toward her. If there's paperwork involving Frank's property, my attorney can review it first. Daniel exhaled heavily beside her. Mom, come on. Why are you making this difficult? Difficult. Such an ugly word for a son to use toward the woman who spent 18 years packing his school lunches and sitting through Little League games in Arizona heat that reached 110 degrees. Vanessa leaned forward slowly. Her voice dropped lower now, colder. You don't understand how these things work, Evelyn. That property is becoming a burden. No, I answered softly. I understand perfectly. That was when she snapped. The plate moved so suddenly, I barely reacted before salmon, asparagus, and sauce slid across the white linen between us. Gasps rose quietly around the dining room. Vanessa stood up, so quickly her chair scraped sharply against the hardwood floor. Which, she hissed. You shouldn't be here. Daniel looked horrified now, but not horrified for me. Horrified because people were watching. Because embarrassment had finally entered the room. I reached for my purse slowly and stood up from the table. My blouse smelled faintly like lemon butter sauce. Vanessa's chest rose and fell rapidly while nearby diners pretended not to stare. I looked directly at my son one last time. I understand now, I said quietly. Then I walked through the silent restaurant toward the front doors. 20 minutes later, sitting alone inside my car beneath the glowing parking lot lights, I made a phone call that changed every relationship in our family forever. The parking lot outside Bellamy's looked strangely peaceful compared to the storm sitting inside my chest. Palm trees swayed gently under the warm Arizona night, while expensive cars rolled slowly through the valet lane as if nothing unusual had happened inside that restaurant. I sat behind the wheel of my Lincoln for several minutes without turning the engine on. My hands rested quietly in my lap. A faint stain from the lemon butter sauce still marked the cuff of my blouse. I stared at it longer than I should have. Funny how humiliation leaves physical evidence behind. At first, I thought I might cry. That would have been normal, probably even healthy. But the tears never came. Somewhere between Vanessa calling me a witch and Daniel asking me to leave, something inside me had gone still. Not broken, just still, like a lake before a storm finally freezes over. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. Grace answered on the second ring. Evelyn, she said immediately. What happened? I looked through the windshield toward the glowing restaurant entrance where couples still walked inside laughing softly with one another. You were right, I said quietly. There was silence on the other end for a moment. Then Grace exhaled slowly. Tell me everything. Grace Whitmore had known me for nearly 40 years. We met when our sons played Little League together in Scottsdale back in the late 1980s. She had seen me through Frank's promotion years, through Daniel leaving for college, through my husband's funeral, and through every lonely holiday that came afterward. More importantly, Grace noticed things other people missed. She noticed how Vanessa interrupted me constantly during family dinners. She noticed how Daniel stopped calling unless he needed something. She noticed how invitations slowly became obligations instead of genuine gestures of love. It started before I even sat down, I told her quietly. Vanessa changed the seating arrangement. She barely looked at me. Then they brought paperwork. Property paperwork. Grace asked immediately. Yes. I knew it. I closed my eyes briefly against the memory of the envelope sliding across the candlelit table. Thick cream paper. Legal documents. Smiles that felt rehearsed. They wanted me to sign something involving Frank's property near Flagstaff. Grace made a quiet sound under her breath. Evelyn, listen to me carefully. Do not sign anything. Not tomorrow. Not next week. Not until Martin reviews every page. Martin Keller had been Frank's attorney for over 25 years. After Frank passed away, Martin helped me navigate probate filings, trust documents, and tax paperwork I barely understood through my grief. Frank always handled financial matters during our marriage, not because he believed I could not manage them, but because we settled naturally into traditional roles over 42 years together. Frank took care of the numbers. I took care of the people. Looking back now, I wondered if that division had quietly left me vulnerable. I already called Martin before I phoned you, I admitted softly. Grace sounded relieved. Good. I leaned back against the leather seat and looked toward the dark Arizona sky. Do you know what hurt the most? I whispered. It was not Vanessa. Grace stayed quiet. It was Daniel. My voice nearly cracked then, but I steadied it. He looked embarrassed. Not because she humiliated me, because people were watching. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Grace said something I would think about for many months afterward. Some men become husbands so slowly they forget how to remain sons. The words settled heavily over me. I remembered Daniel at 6 years old running barefoot through our backyard sprinklers during brutal July heat waves. I remembered him curled against Frank's side during thunderstorms. I remembered packing turkey sandwiches into his Spider-Man lunchbox before elementary school. Mothers spend decades building memories strong enough to survive almost anything. But nobody warns you how painful it feels when your child grows into someone you barely recognize. Come stay with me tonight, Grace offered gently. You should not be alone right now. No, I said softly. I think I need my own house tonight. My home sat quiet at the end of a peaceful cul-de-sac lined with mesquite trees and trimmed desert landscaping. Frank and I bought the property in 1994 when Scottsdale still felt smaller and slower. Back then, Daniel rode his bike up and down these sidewalks until sunset while Frank grilled hamburgers in the backyard on weekends. Every corner of that house still carried traces of our life together. Frank's reading glasses remained folded neatly beside his favorite recliner. His old jazz records still lined the cabinet beneath the television. Sometimes late at night, I could almost convince myself he had only stepped out briefly and would return any moment asking if there was fresh coffee in the kitchen. I finally started the engine and drove home through quiet streets glowing beneath soft streetlights. When I pulled into my driveway, I noticed immediately that my porch light had been left on. I frowned slightly. I always turned it off before dinner. At first I assumed I had forgotten. Age makes people question themselves that way. But when I stepped onto the front porch, I saw the envelope sitting directly beside my welcome mat. The same thick cream envelope Vanessa had pushed across the restaurant table less than an hour earlier. My stomach tightened instantly. Slowly, I bent down and picked it up. My name was written across the front in Daniel's handwriting. Inside the envelope sat several pages clipped neatly together. Property transfer forms, trust amendments, retirement facility brochures, and at the very bottom, attached with a yellow sticky note in Vanessa's sharp handwriting, was a single sentence. This transition will be easier if you cooperate. I stood frozen beneath the porch light while warm desert wind rustled quietly through the trees around me. Then, for the first time that night, I smiled. I carried the envelope into the kitchen and placed it carefully on the granite countertop beside the fruit bowl Frank bought during our trip to Santa Fe almost 15 years earlier. The house felt unusually quiet that night. Even the grandfather clock in the hallway seemed softer somehow, its steady ticking echoing faintly through the dark rooms like a heartbeat trying not to disturb the silence. I loosened my earrings slowly and set them beside the sink. My reflection in the kitchen window looked tired. Older than 67. Older than I remembered feeling that morning. The navy silk blouse still carried the faint smell of restaurant food and perfume. Vanessa's perfume, cold and floral. I hated that I could still smell it. For several minutes, I simply stood there staring at the paperwork without opening it again. Frank used to say people reveal themselves most clearly when they think they have already won. At the time, he had been talking about business negotiations. But standing alone in my kitchen that night, I realized the same thing applied to families. Especially families poisoned slowly by entitlement. I finally sat down at the table and began reading every page carefully. The documents were more aggressive than I expected. They were not simply requesting temporary authority over the Flagstaff property. Vanessa and Daniel wanted permanent transfer rights connected to Frank's trust. Hidden among the legal language were provisions allowing them to manage future property decisions in the best interest of the family. Family, such a beautiful word when spoken honestly, such a dangerous one when used to disguise greed. I turned another page slowly. Retirement housing brochures slipped onto the table. Smiling elderly couples walked through sunny courtyards beneath captions promising comfort, safety, and simplified living. One brochure advertised weekly bingo nights and low-impact exercise classes. Another highlighted emergency medical monitoring and transportation services. I stared at the glossy photos for a long time. It was not the retirement community itself that hurt me. Some people genuinely thrive in places like that. What hurt was realizing my son and his wife had apparently been discussing my future without me for quite some time. Deciding where I belonged. Deciding what I could handle. Deciding when my independence should quietly end. I reached for my reading glasses with trembling fingers. Then my eyes landed on something near the bottom corner of one document. A handwritten note in Daniel's familiar block lettering. Mom gets emotional when discussing Dad. Easier if handled quickly. I stopped breathing for a second. Not because the sentence was cruel. In some ways, it was worse than cruelty. It was clinical, detached, like instructions left beside office paperwork. I leaned back slowly in my chair and closed my eyes. Suddenly memories began surfacing one after another. Small moments I had dismissed over the past 2 years. Vanessa insisting I no longer needed a house key to Daniel's place because they were always home anyway. Daniel encouraging me to cancel my annual road trip to Sedona because travel gets exhausting at your age. Vanessa correcting me in front of strangers whenever I forgot minor details in conversation. Little comments disguised as concern. Little reductions of authority disguised as help. I remembered Thanksgiving last year when Vanessa laughed lightly and said, "Evelyn still balances her checkbook on paper. It is adorable." Everyone at the table chuckled politely while I smiled and passed the mashed potatoes. At the time, I convinced myself she meant no harm. But now I understood something painful. Disrespect rarely arrives loudly in the beginning. It enters quietly, through jokes, through interruptions, through decisions made without you. By the time open humiliation happens, the groundwork has usually been laid for years. Around midnight, my phone buzzed softly against the countertop. Daniel's name appeared on the screen. I let it ring 3 times before answering. "Mom," he said carefully. His voice sounded tired now. Controlled. "Are you home?" I looked toward the envelope still spread across the table beneath the kitchen light. "Yes." Silence lingered between us. Then he sighed. Tonight got out of hand. Out of hand. Such strange wording for a son whose wife had publicly humiliated his mother. "Did it?" I asked quietly. "Vanessa was upset," he continued quickly. "You know how stressed things have been lately." I almost laughed then. Not because anything felt funny. Because people always explain bad behavior by describing the emotions behind it instead of the choices themselves. "Your wife called me a witch in the middle of a restaurant, Daniel." He exhaled heavily again. "She did not mean it like that." I stared at the dark kitchen window, seeing only my reflection looking back at me. How exactly did she mean it? He did not answer immediately. Somewhere in the background, I could hear Vanessa speaking softly. I could not make out the words. "Look," Daniel finally said, lowering his voice. "We are just trying to make things easier for everybody. The Flagstaff place barely gets used anymore. It makes sense to simplify things now instead of waiting until later." Later. Another dangerous word. Frank used to hate that word. Later becomes never more often than people realize. He would say whenever Daniel postponed important decisions as a teenager. I folded my hands together calmly. "Did you know she left retirement brochures at my house?" Silence again. Longer this time. Then Daniel spoke carefully. "Mom, you are alone now." Alone now. Those 2 words settled over me heavier than anything Vanessa had said earlier that evening. Not because they were entirely false. Frank was gone. The house was quieter. Some mornings I woke up and instinctively reached across the bed before remembering there was nobody beside me anymore. But loneliness does not erase intelligence. Grief does not erase ownership. Age does not erase dignity. "I am going to say this once," I told him softly. "You and Vanessa will not make decisions about my life behind my back again." His tone hardened slightly then, just enough for me to notice. "Nobody is trying to control you." I looked down at the paperwork spread across my kitchen table. "That is exactly what you were trying to do." Before he could answer, I ended the call. Then I gathered every document carefully into a neat stack and placed them back inside the envelope. Tomorrow morning, I would drive to Martin Keller's office. And for the first time in a very long time, I was no longer afraid of what I might discover. Martin Keller's office overlooked Camelback Road from the 12th floor of a quiet sandstone building downtown. Frank always liked this office because it smelled faintly of coffee and old leather instead of cold marble and expensive cologne like most law firms in Scottsdale. When I arrived the next morning, the receptionist greeted me gently and offered water before leading me into Martin's private conference room. Sunlight stretched across the polished oak table where thick folders already waited beside a legal pad and 2 steaming coffee mugs. Martin stood as soon as I entered. At 72, he moved. More slowly than he once had, but his sharp gray eyes missed very little. "Evelyn," he said softly, squeezing my hand. "You look tired." I gave him a small smile and sat down carefully. It was a long evening. Martin studied my face for a moment before lowering himself into the chair across from me. "Grace called me last night after you spoke with her." Of course she had. Grace never believed in waiting when trouble appeared. I slid the cream envelope across the table toward him. "They brought this to dinner." Martin opened the flap slowly and began reviewing the documents one page at a time. As he read, the lines around his mouth tightened noticeably. He removed his glasses once, rubbed the bridge of his nose, then continued reading in silence. I wrapped both hands around the warm coffee mug without drinking from it. The room felt very still except for the occasional rustle of paper. Finally, Martin set the documents down carefully. Did Daniel explain any of this to you before asking for your signature? Not really. Did he encourage you to seek independent legal advice? I almost laughed at that question. No, Martin leaned back slowly in his chair. Evelyn, these are not simple transfer documents. I looked toward the window where morning traffic crawled slowly beneath the Arizona sun. I assumed as much. These revisions would significantly reduce your control over several trust assets Frank specifically protected for you. My eyes moved back toward him. Protected? Martin nodded once. Frank was very clear before he passed away. He wanted you financially independent no matter what happened later within the family. Something tightened quietly in my chest hearing those words. Frank had always noticed dangers before I did, even small ones. If a tire looked worn, he replaced it early. If a roof tile cracked, he repaired it before the next storm. I used to tease him for worrying too much. Sitting in Martin's office now, I wondered how much my husband had quietly anticipated before he died. There is more, Martin said carefully. He opened another folder from the stack beside him and slid several pages toward me. About 6 months before Frank passed away, he updated portions of the trust after a private conversation with Daniel. I frowned slightly. Daniel never mentioned that. I do not believe Frank wanted him to. My fingertips rested lightly against the edge of the papers while Martin continued speaking. Your husband became concerned about increasing financial pressure from Vanessa. A strange sadness settled over me then. Not surprise. Sadness. Because deep down, I think I already knew. Frank rarely criticized people openly, but during his final year alive, he often grew quiet whenever Vanessa discussed money. New cars, vacation homes, luxury renovations, investment opportunities. There was always another expensive dream waiting just beyond the next paycheck. Frank told me something during our final meeting, Martin continued. He said, Daniel has a generous heart, but he confuses love with obligation. Vanessa knows how to use that. I stared down at the trust papers while memories slowly rearranged themselves inside my mind. Daniel offering to help organize Frank's office weeks after the funeral. Vanessa insisting certain antique pieces would look better in her house because minimalist design is not really your generation's style. Daniel asking detailed questions about property taxes less than 2 months after burying his father. At the time, grief blurred everything. You assume your family is gathering around you in support. Sometimes they are quietly measuring the walls instead. Martin folded his hands together carefully. Frank established several protections specifically designed to prevent asset manipulation through emotional pressure. I looked up immediately. What does that mean? It means nobody can force property transfers through intimidation, coercion, or mental fitness accusations without triggering automatic legal review. My stomach tightened slightly at those last words. Mental fitness accusations? Martin's expression darkened. Slowly, he reached into the folder and handed me another document. This one was newer, dated just 3 weeks earlier. My eyes scanned the page quickly before stopping cold halfway down. Consultation regarding future cognitive evaluation. Recommendations. Requested by Daniel Carter and spouse. For several seconds, I could not speak. The words blurred slightly beneath my reading glasses. They wanted me evaluated? I whispered. Martin nodded carefully. There was no formal filing. I refused to proceed without evidence of impairment. The conference room suddenly felt too warm. I removed my glasses slowly and pressed them against the table beside me. Cognitive evaluation. Such polite language for something so ugly. I thought about Vanessa correcting me publicly over harmless details. Daniel asking repeatedly if I felt overwhelmed managing the house alone. Small comments about memory, fatigue, stress. They were building something quietly, brick by brick. Why would they do this? I asked softly, though part of me already understood. Martin's answer came gently. Because removing control from competent elderly relatives often begins by questioning competence itself. The silence that followed felt enormous. Outside the office windows, life continued normally. Cars moved through intersections. People carried coffee into nearby buildings. Somewhere below us, someone probably laughed at a harmless joke while I sat frozen in a conference room realizing my own son had quietly explored ways to strip away my independence before ever asking what I actually wanted. Martin slid a small set of keys across the table toward me then. Frank asked me to give you these if I ever believed your security was at risk. I stared at the keys uncertainly. What are they for? A private safety deposit box at Western Valley Bank. My pulse slowed strangely then, because suddenly I understood something important. Frank had not left me vulnerable after all. He had left me prepared. Western Valley Bank sat on the quieter side of downtown Scottsdale, tucked between a law office and an upscale furniture showroom that always smelled faintly of cedar whenever its front doors opened. Frank had banked there for nearly 30 years. The tellers still remembered our anniversary every September. They still asked about his old convertible even though he sold it long before his heart attack. Walking through those familiar glass doors alone felt strange now, like entering a life that technically still belonged to me, but no longer moved the same way. I kept Martin's envelope clutched carefully inside my handbag while soft instrumental music drifted through the marble lobby. A young employee greeted me politely and escorted me toward the private vault area after checking my identification. Everything about the bank felt calm, controlled, safe. It reminded me of the kind of places Frank trusted. Places where people spoke quietly and paperwork mattered more than emotion. The vault manager, a middle-aged woman named Denise, smiled gently when she saw the key Martin had given me earlier that morning. Mr. Carter arranged special authorization instructions years ago, she explained softly while leading me down a long carpeted hallway. He was very thorough. I almost smiled hearing that. Thorough. That was Frank exactly. The man labeled storage bins in the garage with printed stickers. The man who kept every warranty receipt in alphabetical order. The man who once drove 40 miles back to a campground because he worried he might have forgotten to fully extinguish a fire pit. Denise stopped beside a narrow private viewing room and handed me a small metal box retrieved from the vault. Take your time, Mrs. Carter. Then she closed the door behind her, leaving me alone. For several seconds, I simply stared at the safety deposit box resting on the polished table beneath the warm overhead light. My pulse felt strangely loud in the quiet room. Slowly, I inserted the second key and lifted the lid. Inside sat several neatly organized folders, a velvet jewelry pouch, and one sealed envelope with my name written across the front in Frank's familiar handwriting. Evelyn. Just seeing his handwriting again nearly undid me. I traced my fingers lightly over the ink before opening the envelope carefully. Inside was a letter folded twice down the middle. The paper smelled faintly like Frank's old study at home. Leather, cedarwood, coffee. I unfolded the pages slowly and began reading. If you are opening this box without me beside you, then something has already gone wrong. My throat tightened instantly. Frank's voice felt so alive inside those words that for a moment I could almost hear him speaking from across the room. I know you, Evelyn. You will spend too much time trying to understand other people's behavior instead of protecting yourself from it. That is one of the reasons I loved you. It is also why I worried. I sat down carefully in the leather chair beneath the soft light while the letter trembled slightly between my fingers. Frank continued explaining that over the final 2 years of his life, he quietly noticed increasing pressure from Vanessa regarding family finances, properties, and inheritance structures. At first, he believed Daniel would eventually recognize the manipulation himself. But shortly before his illness worsened, Frank overheard a conversation between Daniel and Vanessa discussing future asset distribution, once Evelyn can no longer manage things independently. I stopped reading for a moment and stared at the wall across from me. Once Evelyn can no longer manage things independently. Such careful wording. Not cruel on the surface. Almost compassionate if spoken by strangers. But coming from your own family, it felt like standing in a room where people had already started replacing you before you were gone. I looked back down at the letter. I do not believe our son intends to hurt you, Frank wrote. But weakness does not always arrive through malice. Sometimes it arrives through silence. Sometimes through a spouse who slowly teaches someone loyalty in the wrong direction. Tears blurred my vision then, though I still did not cry fully. Grief after a certain age becomes quieter, heavier, less dramatic, and somehow more exhausting. Frank had understood Daniel better than I did. Maybe fathers often do. Another folded document rested beneath the letter. This one was legal. Property records, ownership structures, trust clauses. I read every page carefully while my heartbeat slowed into something steadier. Frank had placed nearly every major asset under layered protections requiring independent legal oversight for any permanent transfer involving me. The Flagstaff property, the Scottsdale house, investment accounts, even certain family heirlooms. More importantly, Frank had designated me primary controlling trustee over several assets Daniel clearly believed would eventually pass directly into his hands. My fingers tightened slightly around the papers. That explained the pressure. That explained the restaurant dinner. That explained the cognitive evaluation inquiries Martin mentioned earlier. Vanessa and Daniel were not simply trying to simplify things. They were trying to gain control before they lost access entirely. Beneath the legal folders sat one final item. A small flash drive attached to a handwritten label. Only if necessary. I stared at it uncertainly before placing it carefully back inside the box. Frank never dramatized things. If he labeled something necessary, there was a reason. My phone buzzed softly inside my purse just then. Vanessa. I watched her name glow across the screen for several seconds before answering. Evelyn, she said immediately. Her voice sounded smoother today. Controlled again. As if the restaurant scene had already been cleaned away overnight, like spilled wine from a tablecloth. Daniel, and I think it would be best if we all sat down calmly this weekend. I glanced toward Frank's letter still spread open before me. Why? There was a slight pause. Because emotions were high yesterday. Were they? Another pause. Longer this time. We are family. Vanessa continued carefully. Nobody wants unnecessary conflict. Family again. That word had become almost unrecognizable lately. I folded Frank's letter slowly and returned it to the envelope. You are right, I said softly. Nobody should want conflict. My calmness seemed to unsettle her. I could hear it in the silence that followed. Then she cleared her throat lightly. So you will come Saturday? I looked down at the safety deposit box filled with protections my husband quietly built years before his death. Protections I had never fully understood until now. No, I answered gently. I do not think I will. Then I ended the call before she could respond. The strange thing about betrayal is that once you finally see it clearly, old memories begin changing shape right in front of you. Over the next 2 days, I moved quietly through my routines while pieces of the past rearranged themselves inside my mind like furniture in a dark room finally touched by morning light. I watered the roses beside the front walkway. I folded laundry while old jazz records played softly in the kitchen. I drank coffee from the ceramic mug Frank bought me during our trip through Northern California years earlier. Outwardly, everything looked normal. But internally, something had shifted permanently. I was no longer trying to convince myself Vanessa's behavior came from stress or insecurity or misunderstanding. Once denial leaves a person, clarity enters very quickly. Saturday morning arrived warm and cloudless like most Arizona mornings in early spring. By 9 o'clock, sunlight already stretched across the backyard patio where Frank used to read newspapers on weekends wearing faded polo shirts and old leather sandals. I sat at the kitchen table reviewing copies of the trust documents Martin prepared for me while a fresh pot of coffee brewed nearby. Every important asset was now temporarily protected under additional legal oversight until further review. No transfers, no amendments, no evaluations, no financial access changes without my direct authorization and independent legal confirmation. Martin called it precautionary stabilization. Vanessa would probably call it obstruction. Around 10:15, my front doorbell rang sharply. I already knew who it was before opening the door. Vanessa stood outside wearing oversized sunglasses and an expensive cream-colored sweater despite the heat climbing toward 90 degrees. Daniel stood beside her looking exhausted. His shoulders sagged slightly the way Frank's used to after long workdays during difficult years. For one painful second, seeing that resemblance almost softened me. Almost. We tried calling, Daniel said quietly as I stepped aside to let them enter. I know. Vanessa removed her sunglasses slowly while scanning the living room with quick, careful eyes. I noticed immediately that she was searching for signs. Packed boxes, medical paperwork, weakness, something that confirmed the version of me she had already built in her mind. But the house looked exactly as it always had. Clean, organized, calm. Frank's framed photographs still lined the fireplace mantel. Fresh flowers rested near the piano. Nothing here belonged to a confused woman losing control of her life. Can I get either of you coffee? I asked politely. Vanessa blinked slightly, almost thrown by my calmness. No thank you. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. Mom, we really need to talk about what happened. I sat down carefully in my usual chair at the kitchen table, the same chair I had occupied nearly every morning for 28 years. Then talk. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Finally, Vanessa folded her hands together and offered a tight smile clearly practiced during the drive over. We all said things emotionally the other night. You called me a witch in a crowded restaurant. Her smile flickered briefly. I was upset. You also left retirement brochures at my house. Daniel exhaled heavily beside her. Mom, nobody is trying to hurt you. Hurt. Such a careful word. People always choose softer language when discussing damage they personally caused. I looked directly at my son, then explained the cognitive evaluation inquiries. The silence that followed landed heavily across the kitchen. Vanessa's posture stiffened instantly. Daniel's face drained of color. There it was. The moment people realize the information gap has closed. Who told you about that? Vanessa asked quietly before Daniel could answer. Not denial. Not confusion. Just immediate concern about exposure. I folded my hands calmly atop the table. Martin Keller. Daniel looked genuinely startled. Martin had no right to discuss private consultations. Actually, I said softly, he did. Since I am apparently the person you wanted evaluated. Daniel sat down heavily across from me then, suddenly looking older than 38. Mom, it was not like that. Then tell me exactly what it was like. He glanced toward Vanessa instinctively before speaking. That tiny movement hurt more than almost anything else. A grown man still seeking permission from his wife before answering his mother honestly. We were worried about you, he said. Finally, after Dad died, you became isolated. You forget things sometimes. Vanessa nodded quickly beside him. We only wanted to make sure you were protected. Protected. Another beautiful word ruined by manipulation. I stood slowly and walked toward the kitchen counter where Frank's old coffee grinder still sat beside the toaster. Do you remember your 8th birthday, Daniel? He looked confused by the question. What? You got lost at the Phoenix Zoo for almost 40 minutes. His forehead tightened slightly as he searched his memory. I barely remember that. I do. I turned toward him calmly. Your father panicked. He wanted security guards everywhere immediately. But I told him to wait near the entrance because I knew you would retrace your steps once you got scared enough. Daniel looked down quietly now. You walked back, crying with melted ice cream all over your shirt. My voice stayed soft. Steady. I recognized my son instantly, even from across a crowded plaza. Vanessa shifted uncomfortably beside him. Evelyn, what does this have to do with anything? I looked directly at her then. It means I spent decades knowing exactly who my child was. The room fell silent again. Outside, a lawn mower hummed faintly somewhere down the street while sunlight glowed warmly through the kitchen windows. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary morning. Yet everything inside that room had changed permanently. Daniel rubbed both hands across his face before speaking again. Mom, we never wanted this to become ugly. I almost smiled then. Daniel, I said quietly. It became ugly the moment you discussed my mental competence before discussing my feelings. Vanessa stood abruptly from her chair. This is ridiculous. We are trying to help, and you are turning us into villains. I met her gaze calmly. No, your own behavior did that. For the first time since arriving, Vanessa had no immediate response. She simply stared at me while something cold and calculating moved behind her eyes. Then she looked slowly around the kitchen once more. But this time, she was no longer searching for weakness. She was measuring resistance. After Vanessa and Daniel left that morning, the house felt unusually clear to me. Not quieter, not emptier, clearer. Like fog finally lifting from a landscape you have lived inside for years without realizing how little you could actually see. I stood at the kitchen sink for a long time watching sunlight reflect across the backyard pool while the coffee in my mug slowly turned cold beside me. My hands no longer trembled when I thought about the restaurant. They no longer trembled when I pictured the retirement brochures or the cognitive evaluation inquiries either. Fear had exhausted itself. What remained now was something calmer, something steadier. Understanding changes people, especially older women who have spent most of their lives dismissing their own instincts in order to preserve peace inside families. By Monday morning, Martin had already filed temporary legal protections across every major trust asset connected to my name. He also instructed Western Valley Bank to flag any unusual account inquiries involving shared family properties. "You are not overreacting," he told me during our phone call. "You are responding appropriately to coordinated financial pressure." Coordinated financial pressure. Such formal language for betrayal carried out with polite smiles and family dinners. Around noon that same day, my phone buzzed repeatedly while I organized old recipe cards in the kitchen drawer. 3 missed calls from Daniel. 1 voicemail from Vanessa. Then another call immediately after. I let the phone ring until silence returned. 5 minutes later, Grace arrived carrying grocery bags and iced tea from the cafe near her neighborhood. She studied my face carefully the moment I opened the door. "You look different today," she said quietly. "Do I?" She nodded once while setting the bags onto the counter. "You stopped doubting yourself." The truth of that settled over me slowly. For weeks, maybe years, I had questioned my own reactions constantly. Was Vanessa truly disrespectful or merely blunt? Was Daniel distant or simply busy? Was I being excluded intentionally or becoming overly sensitive with age? Women from my generation were trained to minimize discomfort in order to maintain harmony. We learned to smooth over insults before they became conflicts. We learned to apologize for emotional reactions even when those reactions were justified. Somewhere along the way, many of us stopped trusting our own pain entirely. Grace unpacked containers of pasta salad while I sliced lemons beside the sink. "Martin called me too," she said carefully. I glanced toward her. "About what?" "Apparently Daniel contacted him this morning demanding explanations." I almost smiled at that. "And?" "Martin told him all future communication regarding trust matters must go through formal channels." Grace paused briefly before adding, "Daniel did not take that well." I placed the knife down carefully on the cutting board. "Good." The word surprised even me slightly. Not because I wanted revenge. Because for the first time in a long while, consequences were finally entering the room. Later that afternoon, I drove to the grocery store near Hayden Road just before the worst heat settled across Scottsdale. The automatic doors opened with a rush of cool air carrying scents of bakery bread and fresh produce. Everything felt strangely ordinary. Shoppers compared avocados. Children argued over cereal boxes. A florist arranged sunflowers near the entrance. Yet as I pushed my cart slowly past the fruit section, I noticed 2 women glancing toward me before quickly looking away. One whispered something softly to the other. At first I assumed nothing of it. Then near the dairy aisle, an older man approached carefully. "Mrs. Carter?" I looked up politely. He seemed familiar, though I could not immediately place him. "I just wanted to say I am sorry about what happened at Bellamy's." My chest tightened slightly. "Excuse me." His expression turned awkward immediately. "My wife and I were there Friday night." "Of course. The restaurant." Public humiliation never remains private for long in cities like Scottsdale, where wealthy families circle through the same social spaces repeatedly. "People were talking about it afterward," he admitted gently. "You handled yourself with a lot of class." I thanked him quietly before he walked away, but the encounter stayed with me during the entire drive home. By evening, Grace's prediction proved correct. Word had spread. Not wildly, not dramatically, but enough. Enough for people to know Vanessa lost control publicly. Enough for people to notice Daniel failed to protect his mother. Reputation moves carefully through upper-middle-class communities. Nobody says much directly. They simply begin observing differently. Around 7:30 that night, Daniel appeared at my front door alone. He looked exhausted again, but this time there was something else beneath the exhaustion. Panic. "Can I come in?" he asked quietly. I stepped aside without answering. He walked into the living room slowly while loosening his tie. "Martin froze access requests connected to the Flagstaff property," he said immediately. No apology. No concern about my feelings. Straight to the property issue. I sat calmly in Frank's old recliner across from him. "Yes." Daniel rubbed his forehead hard. "Vanessa and I already made renovation commitments based on those plans." "That sounds unfortunate." He stared at me then as if hearing a stranger speak through his mother's voice. "Mom, this is serious." "I know. Contractors are involved. Deposits were already paid." I folded my hands quietly in my lap. "You should not commit money against assets you do not legally control." Silence filled the room heavily after that. Daniel looked away first, toward the family photographs lining the fireplace mantel. toward Christmas portraits and graduation pictures and vacations from years when things still felt honest. Vanessa thinks you are punishing us, he said finally. I studied my son carefully, really studied him. The tired eyes, the anxious posture, the man caught somewhere between guilt and dependence. No, I answered softly. I am protecting myself. He opened his mouth as if preparing another argument, then stopped. Because somewhere deep down, he knew the difference too. 3 weeks passed before Vanessa came back to my house again. By then, Scottsdale had fully surrendered to summer heat. The sidewalks shimmered beneath temperatures climbing past 105 degrees, while hummingbirds hovered beside the desert flowers Frank planted years earlier along the backyard wall. Life outside continued normally, but inside our family, pressure had started cracking things apart quietly. Daniel called less often now, not because conflict disappeared, because distance becomes easier when guilt grows too heavy to carry comfortably. Vanessa, however, moved in the opposite direction. The more control she lost, the harder she pushed. Martin kept me informed carefully without violating legal boundaries. Several additional inquiries had been made regarding trust structures and property access. Contractors connected to the Flagstaff renovation project were suddenly demanding revised payment timelines after discovering ownership complications. One lender reportedly paused financing discussions entirely once the trust protections became visible during review. None of this surprised me anymore. Vanessa built her confidence on assumptions. Assumptions that Frank's assets would eventually become Daniel's assets. Assumptions that age made me passive. Assumptions that grief weakened judgment permanently. The problem with assumptions is that they collapse quickly once facts arrive. That Thursday afternoon, I was trimming basil leaves in the kitchen when I noticed a black SUV pull sharply into my driveway. Vanessa stepped out alone wearing large sunglasses and carrying a leather folder pressed tightly against her chest. She did not wait for me to answer the door before knocking again a second time. Harder this time. I opened the door calmly. Vanessa. She removed her sunglasses immediately. Her makeup looked flawless as always, but strain had finally begun showing around her eyes. We need to talk. Not hello. Not how are you. Straight to urgency. I stepped aside without speaking. She entered quickly, heels clicking across the hardwood floors while scanning the house with visible impatience. Where is Daniel? I asked quietly. At work. She turned toward me sharply. Unlike some people, we still have responsibilities. I almost smiled hearing that. Vanessa always became crueler whenever she felt cornered. Would you like tea? I asked politely. No. She placed the leather folder onto the dining table with controlled force. I want to understand why you were doing this to us. There it was again. That strange reversal. As though protecting myself somehow victimized them. I sat down slowly across from her, while afternoon sunlight stretched through the dining room windows between us. Doing what exactly? Freezing access. Blocking agreements. Turning Martin against us. Her voice remained measured, but anger pulsed beneath every word now. You have created a financial disaster over one misunderstanding at dinner. One misunderstanding. Public humiliation. Secret evaluations. Legal manipulation. Property pressure. Amazing how small harmful behavior suddenly sounds when the people responsible begin facing consequences. This was not one misunderstanding, I said softly. Vanessa laughed sharply under her breath. You really think Daniel and I are some kind of villains? I looked at her carefully then. Really carefully. For years I avoided studying Vanessa too closely because doing so would have forced me to admit uncomfortable truths earlier than I was emotionally ready to face. But now I noticed everything clearly. The tension in her jaw, the exhaustion beneath expensive makeup, the constant calculation behind her eyes even while sitting inside my home. I think, I answered quietly, that you became very comfortable treating me like a problem instead of a person. Her expression hardened instantly. That is not fair. Neither was discussing cognitive evaluations without my knowledge. For a moment, genuine panic flashed across her face before disappearing again beneath anger. You keep repeating that as if we were plotting something evil. Were you? Silence. Not denial. Silence. Vanessa looked away first, toward the family portrait hanging above the fireplace. Frank stood smiling beside me in that photograph, while Daniel, younger and softer back then, wrapped one arm around both of us during a beach vacation in Coronado years ago. We looked like the kind of family people envied quietly. Stable. Warm. Safe. Funny how photographs preserve appearances better than truth. You do not understand how stressful things have become, Vanessa said finally, lowering herself into the chair across from me again. Her voice softened now, less aggressive, more revealing. Daniel has pressure from work. The market changed. We already committed to projects assuming the properties would transition eventually. Eventually. Always eventually. I folded my hands calmly together atop the table. So this was financial planning? It was family planning. Without including me. Vanessa inhaled slowly through her nose. You are making this emotional. I almost laughed then because the irony felt unbearable. No, I said gently. I am making it honest. Outside, wind moved softly through the palm trees while sunlight glowed warm against the kitchen floor. Somewhere down the street, children shouted beside a swimming pool. Ordinary life continued while something irreversible unfolded quietly inside my dining room. Vanessa opened the leather folder then and slid several papers toward me. We are willing to compromise. Compromise. Such an interesting word from someone who once expected surrender. I glanced down at the documents briefly. Revised property proposals. Partial transfers. Shared management language. Softer terms now. Less aggressive than before. Fear had changed their strategy. Martin already reviewed these, I said calmly. Her eyes widened slightly. You sent them to him? Of course. Vanessa leaned back slowly, staring at me as though seeing an entirely different woman sitting across from her now. You really are not going to back down. I met her gaze steadily. No, another long silence settled between us. Then something unexpected happened. Vanessa's shoulders lowered slightly for the first time since arriving. Not defeat exactly. Fatigue. Like someone finally realizing a game had ended without noticing when the rules changed. Daniel said your generation always avoids conflict. She murmured quietly. We usually do. Then why are you fighting now? I looked toward Frank's photograph hanging above the fireplace. Because your generation mistakes kindness for weakness too often. Vanessa followed my gaze toward the portrait. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then she gathered the papers back into her folder carefully and stood up without another argument. At the front door, she paused briefly before leaving. Daniel misses who you used to be, she said softly without turning around. I looked at the sunlight stretching across my quiet living room. So do I. Then she walked out into the Arizona heat, and for the first time since all of this began, I realized Vanessa was no longer certain she would win. Autumn arrived slowly in Scottsdale that year. The air remained warm well into October, but the evenings softened enough for people to sit outside again beneath restaurant patio lights, while desert wind carried the faint scent of mesquite through the neighborhoods. Nearly 4 months had passed since the night at Bellamy's. For months since lemon butter sauce stained my blouse while strangers watched my family unravel in public. Funny how quickly life can divide itself into before and after. Some mornings I still woke up expecting to hear Frank moving through the kitchen downstairs. Other mornings I woke with something entirely different resting quietly inside me. Peace. Not complete peace. Grief does not disappear at my age. But clarity brings its own kind of calm eventually. Daniel and Vanessa stopped pushing after the final trust review meeting with Martin in late August. Once the full legal protections became impossible to challenge, the pressure simply collapsed beneath its own weight. Contractors withdrew from the Flagstaff plans. Financial projections changed. Certain investments apparently became difficult to maintain without anticipated property leverage. I never asked for details. I no longer wanted to live inside their calculations. Daniel called more often after that, though our conversations stayed careful at first. Fragile. Like people walking across ice they once trusted without thinking. He asked about my garden. About church friends. About recipes he suddenly claimed to miss from childhood. Small things. Human things. Once, during a quiet phone call on a Sunday evening, he apologized for the restaurant. Not dramatically, not perfectly, but honestly enough for me to hear the shame beneath the words. I should have stood up for you, he admitted quietly. I sat on the back patio wrapped in a light cardigan, while sunset turned the Arizona sky deep shades of orange and gold. Yes, I answered softly. Silence stretched between us for several seconds. Then he asked the question I think had haunted him for months. Do you hate me now? I looked toward the rose bushes Frank planted beside the pool years ago. Most people think forgiveness arrives suddenly through grand emotional moments. In reality, Forgiveness often arrives quietly while watering plants or folding laundry or watching evening light settle across familiar rooms. No, I told him truthfully. But I see you differently now. He cried softly after that. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough for me to realize my son had finally stopped defending himself long enough to feel what he helped create. Vanessa never apologized directly, at least not in words. But people reveal remorse differently. About 3 weeks before Thanksgiving, a package arrived at my front door containing a new embroidered linen napkin set identical to the one ruined at the restaurant. No card, no note. Just the linens folded carefully inside white tissue paper from an expensive department store in Phoenix. I understood immediately who sent them. I also understood what remained absent. Accountability. Still, I kept the napkins. Not because they repaired anything. Because age teaches you that people often apologize only as deeply as their pride allows. The real surprise came on Thanksgiving morning. Daniel called around 9 o'clock, sounding nervous. "Mom," he said carefully, "would you still come today?" I stood in my kitchen preparing sweet potatoes, while cinnamon and brown sugar warmed the air around me. "I thought you and Vanessa were hosting her parents this year." "We are." He hesitated. "But I want you here too." There was something different in his voice now. Not obligation. Not guilt. Something quieter. Respect, maybe. Or at least the beginning of it. By 4 that afternoon, their house glowed warmly beneath strings of patio lights while soft jazz drifted through open sliding doors into the backyard. Vanessa greeted me at the entrance wearing a dark green sweater and a controlled expression I recognized immediately. Caution. She no longer looked at me like someone evaluating weakness. She looked at me like someone finally aware of boundaries. "Happy Thanksgiving, Evelyn," she said politely while stepping aside to let me enter. "Happy Thanksgiving." Her parents greeted me kindly from the living room. The smell of turkey and rosemary filled the house. Somewhere upstairs, football played softly on a television while dishes clinked in the kitchen. Ordinary family sounds. Yet beneath everything rested a new awareness none of us could ignore anymore. Daniel appeared carrying a tray of drinks before stopping suddenly when he saw me standing near the dining room. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he walked directly toward me and kissed my cheek the same way he used to before school every morning as a little boy. "I am glad you came," he said quietly. This time I believed him. Dinner unfolded carefully at first. Conversations stayed polite, measured. Vanessa remained quieter than usual while passing dishes around the table. Several times I caught her studying me thoughtfully from across the room, as if still adjusting to the reality that I had not disappeared the way she once expected. Halfway through dinner, Daniel stood suddenly from his chair holding his wine glass awkwardly. "Before dessert," he said, clearing his throat lightly, "there is something I need to say." The table fell silent immediately. Even the football announcers upstairs seemed distant now. Daniel looked directly at me. I spent too much time confusing peace with avoidance. His voice wavered slightly, and I let people I love feel unwanted because it was easier than confronting uncomfortable things. Vanessa lowered her eyes quietly beside him. "Mom," he continued softly, "you deserved better from me." Nobody moved for several seconds after he finished speaking. Then I looked around the table slowly, at the candlelight reflecting against polished glasses, at Frank's grandson sitting beside me eating cranberry sauce with far too much enthusiasm, at the family photographs lining the hallway walls behind Daniel's shoulder. Families survive many things, but only when truth finally enters the room. I reached for my water, glass calmly. "Thank you," I said quietly. And for the first time in a very long while, nobody treated my voice like background noise. Later that evening, after dessert plates were cleared away and cool desert air drifted softly through the open patio doors, Daniel pulled out the chair beside him at the dining table before anyone else sat down again. "Mom," he said gently, "sit here." It was a small gesture, almost invisible to anyone outside the family, but I understood what it meant immediately. Respect had finally returned the moment I stopped begging for love.